Grant, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, John, great to be here.
So you obviously host a podcast yourself. Do you appear on a lot of other podcasts, or?
Yeah, I've been on a few. It's kind of a surreal feeling being on the other side of the microphone and having to respond to the questions. But I really enjoy the format. I find it's great for having kind of little deeper discussions but still being informal.
Absolutely. So do you like one side versus the other? Or?
Yeah, I don't know. It depends on, I'll let you know after you ask me the questions, depending on how easy or hard they are.
I'm always asking the tough questions, Grant. So
yeah. I think for sure there's a lot more prep work to go on as the host, but you do have a little bit more predictability, I guess, in it. So.
Very cool. Yeah, I was on one fairly recently here in this studio, and somebody else's, and I really enjoyed it because I didn't have to do any prep work. It's just I get to be myself. As long as you're being interviewed by somebody who's nice, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. If it's more of a journalistic approach, then you got to be a little bit more on your game for sure.
Exactly. So. Great. So first of all, you were one of the founders of Lucidworks. Can you tell the listeners what Lucidworks is?
Sure, yeah, happy to. So Lucidworks is an enterprise search company or a search company that provides search engine software built on top of Apache Solr and Apache Spark. So myself and a couple other people who were pretty deeply involved with the Lucene and Solr community, which is really one of the flagship open source search engines out there. Back in 2007, set about to build a company around that software, and really a lot of the rest is history from there. But people may not think about search beyond just what they get with Google or a Bing or a DuckDuckGo, but really a lot of websites and applications, both publicly available and inside the enterprise, have search engines built into them. So chances are your listeners have all used software that I've written. Mm-hmm. If you go to companies like Home Depot or Lowe's, or you happen to be a banking client of, say, like a Morgan Stanley, you've probably used software that I've written and that Lucidworks has built. So,
and I'm fascinated by Lucene and Solr and that whole movement. A lot of that came out of Google. Is that correct? Some of that technology was based on a white paper that was released by Google, or am I mixing this up?
Yeah, I think, there's aspects of course, of Google's influence on search engines because, obviously they've been super successful. But, the core of what Lucene does actually goes back to the 70s and some of the early information retrieval research that academics have done on basically how do you help people find information. But the really cool story behind Lucene as a founding is Doug Cutting, who is also the creator of Hadoop, which many people are familiar with. That actually came out of Google. But Doug actually wrote Lucene.
Yeah, you've now hit the nail on the head for why I made the confusion. Yeah. It was the Doug connection between Lucene and Hadoop. So
yeah. So Doug actually wrote Lucene as his very first Java program. Like he was like, "Hey, I'm going to learn Java. I'm going to sit down and write a search engine." Most of us mere mortals end up writing like Hello World as our first program. But Doug wrote a search engine, probably the most successful search engine in open source, and then what happened actually is Hadoop came around via a Google paper, and that was actually part of the Lucene community as well as a means to build out, we were building an open source crawler at the time called Nutch, which still exists today. And that was built off of this notion of MapReduce and a distributed file system, which is Hadoop. And so Doug started on that as well. So
That's awesome. So how long ago did you guys get together to start Lucidworks?
Yeah, so that was back in 2007. We were originally called Lucid Imagination, and then I think we changed our name. I forget when, but really started off as let's kind of bootstrap ourselves, and then we raised venture capital in 2008 to the tune of $6 million, and then raised another round in 2010, and then a couple more rounds after that. So those early days were what I call the open source 1.0 business model. And then, we had to reinvent ourselves a number of times as we tried to figure out how to make it, shift from just a support and consulting business into a product and beyond business, I guess, if you will.
It's interesting because so I spent a couple of years at Red Hat, and I think they, more than anybody, perfected how do you make money off of open source. And one of the things that I realized in working for Red Hat for a couple of years was that it's free software. That doesn't mean that the product is free. It's just that it's free. It's just cheaper to develop if you can commercialize the software. It's already been developed and it's maintained largely by the open source community. And so when you get that business model right, you really can make a lot of money, which obviously they sold for $35 billion to IBM selling free software.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I mean, I think search is a little bit more of a niche space than that core product of an operating system where people need production support. And so, early on, we tried to do a lot of that. Just, hey, here's this thing that will support a la a Red Hat. But we actually had to change over time. And we took much more of an approach around how do we complement and extend it with commercial features that the open source community wasn't supporting or building on their own, especially focused in, starting in about 2011, 2012 around machine learning capabilities that the community just wasn't doing at the time. And so we had a lot of focus on that area. And that really was a key to the success because frankly, the support business just wasn't there. I mean, we built some decent revenue, but not VC backed revenue, right? Like not the kind that a venture capitalist is going to get out of bed in the morning for. So we really had to figure out a different way to go to market.
Yeah, that's awesome. So were you guys contributors to Lucene and Solar as well, I take it, or?
Yeah, for sure. We have, or we had, I often speak in the present tense because I guess I still am a shareholder there, but we actually have a team that pretty much does nothing but contribute to Lucene and Solar. That is still a key part of that business because it's at the core of what the product is, right? So we want to make sure that it has the capabilities to meet the demands of people. And it's also just giving back as well.
Sure, absolutely. I think a lot of corporate users of open source don't realize that it's a two-way street and that you should be contributing back. So I take it that when you guys develop features, for your clients, is there some sort of decisioning process to say this needs to go into core Lucene versus this is inside of the Lucidworks platform?
Yeah, and I mean, they may have changed since I've left, but I mean, for the most part, we took the approach that, you kind of, it when you see it. I tended to view it as, and I still do, is when it's kind of what I would call inner loop things, when it really needs to be close to the heart of where the data is, or if it's going to be most efficient for everybody in that place, we would want to put that back in. And so we tended to build on top of as opposed to in, so that all this stuff where we were like modifying or creating plugins that go very low level, Solar or Lucene, those just all went back to the community. And that was a really good model. And then, like I said, we often, especially these days with search engines for the most part being commoditized, the real bang for the buck is on top of it and how you ask questions of it. And so that made it a lot more straightforward to decide what do you put in the engine and what do you keep on top or in your product.
Awesome. So you talked a little bit about the history of search before. You mentioned that there's technology that was developed in the 70s or research that was done in the 70s and theories about how we should go about doing search. What was the biggest commercial offering in search prior to these Apache offerings?
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting. I mean, open source in a lot of ways disrupted this market, but, kind of late 90s, even into the 2000s, I guess probably there was a couple of main players, and there's been iterations. People may remember a company called Fast. Microsoft actually bought them. They may also recall a company called Endeca, which Oracle bought. Endeca was, in many ways, the leader in the e-commerce space for a long time. So if you wanted to do search for e-commerce on your site, you bought Endeca.
Okay.
Quite expensive. Solar went after Endeca pretty hard. Some of the key features in Endeca were, commoditized into Solar pretty early on. And so that tended to be where Solar shined the most. Fast tended to be much more enterprise search. So kind of think about it as like behind the firewall, like how do I find that document that I, wrote 6 years ago that says what our strategy is going to be for whatever, right? And so those were the two big players, two very large exits, but then very quickly, I think open source just pretty much ate their lunch, such that I don't know that Microsoft or Oracle actually saw much value out of their acquisitions.
Okay, interesting. So Bing has nothing to do with that technology.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, at the heart of it, there's probably some core, but I don't even think those are necessarily specific features. I'd be surprised to find out, but I don't know for sure.
Sure. I had used an offering from Alta Vista at some point. I know that they hosted a site that people used to go to before Google, but they also had an SDK.
Yeah, there was companies like Alta Vista sold enterprise search and non-internet search, right? There was Verity. There's a few other players in that space. So you can. There's a long history of search, and kind of every 5 to 10 years is an iteration. I think right now we're in this new phase of how do we incorporate deep learning and new machine learning techniques into search to provide better results. So I think because of Elasticsearch and because of their IPO, you're seeing a lot of investment in how search can be leveraged by companies to do more than just keyword search, if you will. Some regards to things like Splunk is also a search engine, just happens to be tailored towards logs. So you see a lot of vendors who are perhaps, domain specific in the search market as well.
Absolutely. I just finished a book called Amazon Unbound, and they talked a lot in there about how important search ultimately has become to even Amazon's business model. And it's a very big threat to Google, because if I can go to Amazon and search for products, why I'm not going to Google, obviously. So.
Yeah, for sure. And I think and that's often what I see in that market is there's kind of two parts to the market. There's folks who monetize search, so primarily e-commerce, but other people do as well. And their relevance and ranking and those kinds of things are really important, because you want to make sure you're getting the right products in front of people so that they'll convert, right? And then the other side of the market is often just, like I said earlier, that enterprise use case or personal use case of like, where's that document I wrote that has the thing and I need to find it out, find it. And that tends to be a little bit more of a checkbox type feature of like, hey, yeah, we need search engine for, say, a Google Drive. Right. But it doesn't add as much value in people's minds as, say on an e-commerce website.
Yep, absolutely. So talk to me a little bit about how you and your co-founders came together as a group, kind of what different roles each other plays, and just that whole process of deciding, because there's usually like several discussions before somebody says, okay, we're doing this, right? I'd love to hear that story.
Yeah, it's actually a little bit interesting. So this was, I guess, circa 2007. One of our co-founders, a guy named Mark Krellenstein, who was actually at one of those older search engines way back in the day called Northern Light. So if anybody remembers Northern Lights in your audience, it was an early web search engine. He was the CTO of Elsevier, the large publishing company, and he approached a number of us committers on the Lucene and Solar project, myself, Yannick Seeley, Eric Hatcher, and a number of others, and said, hey, I think the time is right to start a company to support this open source project called Lucene and Solar. And Yannick and Eric and myself all bit, essentially. We started talking about it. We started to figure out how we could bootstrap. So we actually bootstrapped an angel investor for the first year. The really funny thing about it is I'd met Yannick once in person. I had never met Mark in person. And Eric Hatcher, I met for the first time at our very first in-person company meeting. But we had been working online together for 3, 4, 5 years at that point in time. So it was kind of a modern internet business, if you will.
And this was before the days of Git. So were you guys?
Yeah.
What was this on Subversion? Or
yeah, that was. I think even the earliest part of it was CVS, if people remember that.
I remember CVS. Yeah.
And then Subversion was the primary one for the Apache Software Foundation at the time. And so yeah, it was all mailing lists and IRC and got together, and then we all flew up to Boston for one weekend and got together and basically started the company.
That's
so
great.
Kind of surreal though to never really. I don't know if I would recommend that for most people out there, but I felt like I knew them well enough just based off of what I'd seen of them on the mailing lists and phone calls and kind of the old-fashioned way of getting together.
Sure, and if if it's an active project, you're collaborating a lot.
Yeah,
and you're relying on each other a lot for
yeah,
things.
many of us were. I don't think I was kind of being paid to work on it at that point in time. I worked in a research lab at Syracuse University at the time, and so a lot of my work was built on top of Lucene at the time, and so I would start contributing back to the project as part of the work, and so that made, in some regards I was being paid, but that was a different shift from later on where it was like, no, your whole job is going to be to work on Lucene or Solar.
Wow. So going from working at a university to an angel-funded startup, because it's not like you guys found your first customer and started it. You raised money. That's quite an adjustment.
Yeah, I mean, we had some kind of in the bank, and from that we started by doing consulting right off the bat, right? There was kind of a built-up demand for that. But yeah, it was a little bit of a leap at the time of where's my salary going to come from? Mm-hmm. And on top of it, I had just moved to North Carolina and to RTP, so the Raleigh area, and I just kind of felt like, hey, if it didn't work out, I could get a job. Part of the reason we moved to RTP is because there's a strong tech scene there. So I figured I'd land on my feet even if it didn't work out.
But and that's a great point. When I first moved to Charlotte, I started hiring bankers for the first time in my career, and they were always like, "It's risky going to a small company," and I'm like, no, what's risky is what you're doing at this bank, because these banks will routinely lay off 20,000 people at a time, and it doesn't matter who you are. You may be in the firing line, and you've got skills that only matter at this bank. When you go to work for a startup and you're figuring everything out, you're building very, very real skills that are in demand. And I think most people, at least in technology startups, the technologists will tell you, yeah, you can write your own ticket afterwards.
Yeah, for sure. I think, I used to have kind of that fear as well. And a good friend of mine put it as like, Grant, like, who else are you going to bet on? Nobody else is going to bet on you. You have to bet on yourself. And that really resonated with me as like, you've got, in fact, part of my motivation, I was working in university, and there's a lot of good things about working at a university, right? It tends to be more chill. Mm-hmm. It tends to have really good benefits, surprisingly good benefits. Like my 401k match was 17% at the time. And they paid for private school tuition as well, right? So some really nice benefits. But I think one year I was in and I was talking to, one of the admins who handled like, payroll. I'm like, how do I get a raise? And they're like, well, you get your 2% every year. And I'm like, yeah, but my skills are really in demand. I'm a programmer. I know this hardcore technology. I get people from the outside asking me all the time. And that was just kind of that kick in the pants that said, you know what, it's time to take this under my own control.
That's awesome. So from stalking you on LinkedIn, it looks like you spent about 10 or 11 years in that whole world. I don't know if you were necessarily working Lucidworks that whole time, but between the open source committing and when I look back at 10 to 11 years, I've never spent that much time on any one thing. So talk about the decision process to move on after that's been your life for that long.
Yeah, I think it was 12 years, and fun little side story is I actually left the company in 2011 as well for 2 months or so, and then came back. It was interesting. It didn't feel as long, mainly because I reinvented myself there, I think probably 5 or 6 times. Mm-hmm. And we'll get to answering your question because of that, right? Because I think, anybody who's been a founder or been early at a company, you realize as the company grows, like the needs of the company change. And, if you want to stay there, if you want to be successful, if you want the company to be successful, especially as a founder, you have to change how you approach things. So early on was doing a lot of product development, and then turns out I really like to engage with customers. So then I shifted into being much more customer focused. Then I took on a C-level role and as a CTO, and CTO can be a lot of different things as well, right? Early on, I was running engineering as CTO, and then later the CTO role became again more field facing. And then I also did some bootstrapping of our machine learning capabilities. So it was a lot of different hats, and all of that, to flash forward to answering your question, was, come around 2019, the company was at another inflection point, and I was yet again being asked to change my role and all of that. And, by that time I felt like this baby of mine was now in teenager phase. We had some really strong leadership and position. It was well funded, and it just felt like a good time to look to do something else, right? And I didn't really feel like I was up for another, role change or reinvention of myself at the time. So, and then along came the Wikipedia recruiter with this role of CTO at Wikipedia or Wikimedia, called the Wikimedia Foundation. That's why most people know Wikipedia. They don't always know Wikimedia Foundation, but came along with this role of being the CTO at basically what I consider to be one of the greatest gifts to humanity, this incredible project of free knowledge that is shared all around the world. And
they've had some real heavy hitters in that CTO seat over there too. I mean, this is a long history of very, very good people coming through Wikimedia.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing project and a pretty amazing set of capabilities. And it just felt like the combination of those two things came together and said, I've spent a lot of my career around how do I help people find and use information to make better decisions. And it felt like, what better place to do that than helping Wikipedia and Wikipedia users do that. And so took the leap in 2019, and here we are today.
Awesome. So don't want to spend too much time on Wikimedia, but I am curious. When I think of the challenges that they face there purely from a technology perspective, forget about the behavioral side and graffiti and everything else that's out there. But from a pure technical perspective, it seems like they've got some pretty serious scalability and security challenges that they face. Can you speak a little to those and maybe any other challenges that operating at their scale presents?
It's been pretty fascinating. The cool thing for your listeners here, and I'll let this sink in a little bit because I think most people don't know this about the foundation and about the code, is all of it is open source, right? So if you ever want to understand how a really large scale website, so top 10 website, 20 billion page views a month.
And lots of writing too. It's not read only.
It is very heavy read. It is read heavy, but there are lots of writes. And in fact, some of the times where one of the challenges we often have is when there's like a celebrity death or some other big event where we get a huge spike in reads and a huge spike in writes, and that presents some really interesting technical challenges for us. But like I said, the cool thing about all of that is it's all open source. You can go look and you can go understand how we run things, and that can be a real asset to anybody who's interviewing or wants to learn more about scaling. So, but to answer your question, yeah, like the scale side of the house is really challenging and really interesting, and has for the most part been homegrown over the years and kind of built up over time. As this is a 20-year-old project, right? So we've learned a lot along the ways around how to do that. We've built out our own, essentially CDN, content distribution network, so that we can distribute our data globally, effectively and efficiently. We do have a lot of challenges around how do we best support the distribution of that content in terms of security, in terms of scale. So those are some of the key things. And, and on the security front, for instance, we deal with everything from, your average vandal who just is like, hey, I wanted to write some stupid thing on somebody's biography page. You often see it with, like, for instance, professional athletes. They'll make some comment about, how that quarterback or whatever failed in some situation, right? Like at the Super Bowl, all the way through to like state actors and organizations who want to spread disinformation, right? So we have to fight all of that. We also have to, make sure that we are providing the services that allow our amazing community. And most people don't also recognize this, but like, we're not the editors of the content at the foundation. There's this slew of editors. I think we're something like 250,000 editors who just give their free time to contribute to this incredible project. And it's really humbling to see that, right? And so our job on the software side and the technology side is to make sure that's available, make sure it's secure, make sure it's usable, all the things that go into building modern software behind the scenes. And, a lot of people don't recognize or see the kind of the stuff that happens behind the scenes with the tooling and the editors that really make for a high quality site, right? They think, oh, well, I can just go in and anybody can edit, but there's actually a lot of workflows that go in behind the scenes, such that, we're managing about 2 million plus lines of code. We run our own data centers. So we have, I think, somewhere between 2,200 and 2,500 servers in our fleet deployed around the world.
I would have guessed a lot more given how performant it is.
Yeah, it's actually really amazing. It's funny because I think sometimes there's this notion that so we raise money through donations. I think there's sometimes this notion that oh, hey, Wikipedia only runs on a handful of machines, and then for guys like you and me who know technology, I think like I came in here and I was just blown away by how lean and efficient we were, right? Like when I compare it to other really large scale websites, probably if I had to guess, Google or Facebook, their worst performing product probably has 10x the number of engineers working on it that we do, right? And so it's really kudos to all the people over the years who have built this out. And like I said, we do have some advantage in that we are very read heavy. It's probably, 80-20. Okay. 80 to 20. For every 80 reads, there's 20 writes, something like that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a lot of fascinating problems in there.
Absolutely. And so forgive my ignorance, but I know you can stand up a wiki pretty easily internally in any business. There are lots of organizations who stand up wikis for internal knowledge management. Is wiki just a class of software, or is there actually a wiki that is the software that is wiki, or is it just a term that we use interchangeably between very similar products?
Yeah, wiki itself is a generic term of user editing or user collaborative, but we do at the heart of all of this is a quote unquote product. It's all open source called MediaWiki, which is actually used by a number of other sites and companies. So, for instance, I think publicly NASA, for instance, uses MediaWiki for all of their internal documentation, or a lot of it. In fact, I think one of the really cool things that happened last year was somebody on the space station did an edit of Wikipedia from the space station.
That's awesome.
So they're big users of MediaWiki, and there's lots of other companies and all of that. So there's actually a whole ecosystem around the software, not just for Wikipedia. And then, of course, running a site like ours, we have lots of other things that we surround MediaWiki with. So back to my beloved search, we run a very large scale search cluster that supports search across 300 languages. We have a machine learning stack. We have a Hadoop stack, all of those kinds of things that support and plug into MediaWiki as the core serving platform, if you will.
So when a vandal comes along and makes changes that aren't correct, I know in the early days of using Wikipedia, somebody comes along and fixes it. So it's more of a crowdsourced solution. Is that something that's more active, where you guys can use a machine learning to flag things and say, hey, this appears to be vandalism?
Yeah, it's actually, it's pretty fascinating. So one of the other things that's interesting that I learned once I got here was we have this, I don't know if you call it a product or whatever. It's called Wikimedia Cloud Services. And so we have what I would call a version of a cloud offering that basically anybody in the world who wants to do wiki things or Wikipedia things can come and write their own bots, write their own tools, and we'll run them for them. And they often interact back with the site. And so to answer your question, one of the interesting things is our community over time has built hundreds of these, if not thousands, that actually do a lot of what I like to call the grunt work And so things like vandalism, especially the simple vandalism that often happens by, I'll call them, teenagers who are just being dumb, but those bots will pretty quickly usually get them. We also have some machine learning models that we've built over the years with the community. So one of the cool things we do there is, like I like to say, is we have machine learning that is privacy preserving, community governed, right? And if you think about the state of machine learning these days and how most of these companies leverage it without our knowledge, we actually make that very transparent to people, right? You can see the data we trained it off of for the most part. Obviously, if it has some features you can't always share, but how we run it is all transparent, et cetera. So there's that first layer of defense, if you will. But then, there's editors, or we call them patrollers, who just love to kind of come in and squash that stuff, right? Like they volunteer and they keep an eye on pages they care about. And anytime there's a vandalism act, they just very quickly revert that stuff. And then that gets tagged and is often then fed back into the machine learning systems or the rule-based systems that we have in place. So it's quite fascinating. It's like an immune system, actually. It's very fascinating to see.
That is interesting for sure. COVID got me thinking about a lot of that. Like, I think that the way that viruses travel, and again, it's front and center in our minds because of what we've gone through in the last 18 months or so. But knowledge moves that way with memes, and it's just fascinating to me how the two they grow the same way. So it's interesting that you say that. So I want to shift gears a little bit because I'm always fascinated by open source projects. I think the crowdsource aspects of Wikipedia that you're talking about are also equally fascinating, but I think that, just open source projects and how they come together, I'd like to dig in a little bit on that if you don't mind. So first of all, how did you get involved in becoming a committer? Was there a particular project you were using a lot, or?
Yeah. So I started my career in the mid 90s, so kind of open source was just starting to emerge. If folks remember, obviously it had been around for quite some time at that point.
It was a SourceForge kind of days?
Yeah, SourceForge, early Apache HTTPD. For the folks, we're in the Wayback Machine now, but the Jakarta project, remember like Tomcat and the things that you had to do.
Jakarta Commons. And
so like early 2000s, places I was working at, we were using a lot of that stack early on. So primarily started as a user, like I think most developers, back in the late 90s, trying to figure out how to build these newfangled web applications that we were all doing, right? The bad old days. And then I took a job at Syracuse University, which I alluded to earlier, at a place called the Center for Natural Language Processing. And I was hired to build an Arabic-English cross-language search system. So in other words, you could put in English as your keywords and you could get back documents in Arabic. Wow. Right? You can imagine at the time in 2004 who was paying for that. But so I walked in the door and my boss said, we use this engine called Lucene and go figure it out. And I had built cross-language search systems before that, in fact, at an earlier company. And I said, great. So I downloaded the source code. I think it was like version 1.3. And just for perspective, I think we're on version 8 or 9 right now.
Oh, wow.
And hundreds of releases in between. And started building this Arabic English thing that we needed, right? And back in the day, even then, Lucene had support for Unicode, which is pretty key to handling cross-language systems or multilingual systems. But it didn't have certain features. And so I got permission from my boss to start adding those features to the engine. And, a lot of people like to build up kind of a myth around how you become an active contributor to a project, but it really just started that simple of scratching an itch. And
I guess because it's academia, it's easier for them to wrap their head around you contributing it back to the community.
Well, yes and no, because academia also has kind of this built-in, you need to publish on these kinds of things. And universities take very seriously licensing rights as well. So it took a little bit actually to get through the lawyers, maybe not as much as like a big corporate entity, but it still took a couple of rounds of like, wait, you want to do what? But I convinced them that, this really wasn't like anything we would license. It's all pretty well known. And, the funny story is I like to say is like a lot of times when you just show up in open source and you start contributing, eventually the people who actually have the rights to commit or merge your code base say, hey, you know what? I'm tired of merging and committing your work. I'm just going to give you the rights to do that. And that's effectively how that worked is. And so, from there, I just started doing it more and more. And I found myself doing it at home in my spare time as well. Mm-hmm. And, like I said, here we are now, right?
That's great. So you've also created your own projects that are available open source, correct?
Yeah, I started kind of coming out of maybe in the 2007, 2008, kind of the same time as we founded the company. I started a project along with a couple of other people from the Lucene community called Mahout or Mahout, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Built around large-scale machine learning. Again, one of the problems we were seeing in that space that was emerging is how to use machine learning to improve the results of search, right? And so a number of us got together and built out some core algorithms there that we thought would be interesting for people to leverage. And that project grew pretty well until it kind of plateaued out. It still exists today. I'm not very active in it, but has some neat features.
So how different is it when you're creating a project and kind of owning it versus just committing to one? I assume there's some different responsibilities and expectations.
Well, both of these were Apache projects. So actually, one of the cool things about working at a foundation or doing your open source via a foundation like Apache is they have a lot of infrastructure that supports committers and developers, right? And they have some governance models built in. And so actually, because we did Mahout at Apache, there was a little bit of an incubation period that we had to go through, but for the most part, it was pretty similar compared to like maybe some other projects that just run on their own without, say, a foundation on like a GitHub or something like that. So thankfully, I didn't have to, carry as much weight as you might. I didn't have as much of that burnout that you often see in people who create their own project and kind of get overwhelmed with its success. One of the key models of Apache is it actually can survive any one person leaving the project, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There is so much infrastructure and so much history there, and it does seem fairly prescriptive, I think, the way that Apache projects incubate and then run. It's fascinating. What has surprised you the most through the years working in the open source software community?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think it's been incredible. It's been an incredible ride for starters. I think I started out just as scratching my own itch, like I said, and then the places it took me and the people I've met, I think I had no clue, that it was going to lead to such an interesting, number of years, right? Like I've traveled the world because of open source. I've met, thousands, if not tens of thousands of people all around the globe, all, who are engaging in this project. And that's really humbling. And it's also really satisfying. I think also, one of the things that's often left unsaid, I hinted at a little bit though, is that, you can get burnt out on this stuff too, if you're not careful. Right. And, especially these successful projects like you were talking about earlier, this is why there needs to be a two-way street of people giving back, especially the large corporations who leverage this stuff and often don't, because, their burnout's very real, because you have, I like to call it the creator's dilemma, right? Like you want to help everybody use this thing that you care so much about and that can help them, and it's great and all these things, and they keep coming and they say, hey, I need this, right? And you want to help them, and then eventually, like you're just like you're working all the time on it. You're trying to get all the patches.
Well, it's global, so it's not like it's one time a day that you get to turn off.
Exactly, and so like one of the things I really had to figure out, which was surprising, it took me actually a while, was to realize I was getting burnt out on that model. because I wanted, we all wanted to help and see the project be successful, but I had to take a step back and figure out how to put it in context and really work through like how to better manage that. And that was something I totally did not expect. I was like, oh, great, I get paid to work on this thing, and that's going to be awesome. And then, a few years in, you're like, yeah, this is a lot of work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's easy to lose sight of that because it's so easy to just pull down an open source project and start working with it, and then submit a patch request or get on the message board and start complaining. So one of the things that's been really interesting to me about open source is just how it isn't just the great software that's been created by it in all of these communities, but open source as a mindset and a way of building an organization seems to really have taken off inside of companies, and they even call it insourcing. And there's a whole cottage industry around that as well. But I think just the way it's driven, it's just the symbiotic relationship between the tools and the processes and the methodologies. I don't know without open source if we could get such a robust ecosystem as what we've got right now for even non-open source projects, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a deeper, more philosophical discussion to be had there, but it is fascinating, and I think one of the things you often then realize, or at least another maybe perhaps surprising conclusion for me, is that in some regards the software doesn't actually matter when it's open source, right? Because like it does, obviously, you're running this code, but the more important thing is the people and the processes and how you're leveraging that. And in some ways the software has become commoditized, right? Mm-hmm. Because then there's this whole proliferation of other projects that are just like yours or similar. And so you start to change the way you think about how you're going to leverage code, right? And you really need to put a lot more emphasis on is this meeting my requirements? Is this meeting the business goals I have? It's not just a technology choice, which I think early on I would just, oh yeah, it's a technology choice. I'm a technologist, everything, that's my hammer. But, you have to put it in a broader perspective of how is this going to serve, what I need out of it, right? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So I'm going to shift gears again. I mentioned at the beginning that you host a podcast. You host Developmentor. Did I say that correctly? Or?
You did, yeah. Okay. A little, what is that, a portmanteau? Yeah. I think, right? Somebody will correct me.
What types of topics do you cover, and what sorts of guests do you host on the show?
Yeah, so Developmentor kind of started out of a couple of ideas, and it built around how do you help people navigate careers in technology, right? Like my son, who's now in college, but in high school, is trying to figure out, hey, what do I want to do in my life? And he's like, I really like technology, but I also really like art, right? Especially like 3D modeling and 3D animation. And I'm like,
that's a potent combination.
Yeah. Well, but he kept saying to me, he's like, Dad, I'm just gonna be a programmer. Not just, but like, hey, that's a really good life. I can make a good living at it. I kind of sensed, and it's changed now that he's into it, but I kind of sensed he wasn't super passionate about it. He liked it, but didn't really know a lot about it. And so as we got to talking, I'm like, well, have you ever heard of this role of like, say, a creative director, or, some of these newer roles, which are a combination of art and technology, right? And he had never heard of it. And my wife had never heard of it. And more people I talked to realized they had never heard of it. And then as I broadened that, I realized there's a lot of roles in technology that people aren't familiar with, right? There's kind of this cult of personality around developers, right? And obviously developers bring a lot to building software, but as you know, right, it takes a whole village, as they say, to run a business. Mm-hmm. You can't just have developers. In fact, that was one of the lessons I learned early on at Lucidworks. The 4 founders were all technologists, right? We did not figure out the business side until we actually brought people in, surprise, who knew how to run a business and how to market and how to sell and all that kind of stuff, right? And so one of the things I want to highlight is all the different paths people can take in this. You don't have to be a coder, right? It's good that you know how code is leveraged. Everybody should understand how to use code, what it's good for, what it's not good for. But I do not buy into this everybody must learn how to code model, And so, but there's a lot of other ways we can participate in this economy that are absolutely amazing and probably fit with more people's skill sets and things they like, right? And so the show is really trying to help people navigate that. And I primarily do that by interviewing people who can highlight their career path and all the twists and turns they take. I tend to really like having on guests who have done it differently, right? So I've had everything from psychology majors turned CIOs to convicted felons turned digital marketers to people who have gone the PhD and academic route and gotten all the degrees, as it were, right? And I really just try to let them tell their story and then, perhaps add in comments. And then every now and then we also filter in some bonus episodes that cover particular topics in careers, right? So we had a episode on salary negotiation, that kind of stuff.
Oh, very interesting. How did you figure out that you wanted to create a podcast? You mentioned that your son was thinking about his career. Was that it, or were there other pieces there that made you think, I'm going to go create a podcast?
Yeah, and again, this was actually all of that transition that I mentioned earlier, leaving Lucidworks and going to Wikimedia. All of this kind of stuff started happening at the same time. But I always wanted something as a creative outlet on the side. I thought maybe in the long run it could lead to an interesting business model as well, but kind of side hustle-ish. But I wanted something that was my own, I guess, in a lot of ways. I felt like I was in a good position to be able to engage with people on this topic because I've held a lot of different roles over the years. And, running a business, you tend to see a lot of the different roles in effect, right? So it just kind of came together, and I don't know that there was a particular spark at any one moment that I must do a podcast, but it also felt like podcasts were really starting to take off. And so I just started emailing people I thought would make for good guests, and here we are today. It's actually on pause right now, but I'm going to restart it in the fall here. So
awesome. What surprised you the most as you started interviewing guests?
Oh, yeah. What surprised me most? I think there's been a number of guests who I've had on where there's nothing on paper that tells their real story.
Yeah.
And so you would get in there and you would ask these questions very open. My whole thing was just like, I'm just going to ask open-ended questions and let the guest talk, right? And try to guide them so it's not too long. But they, like some of the stories that don't come out on, like, say, a LinkedIn profile or a resume, right, of just their background, kind of the ups and downs they've gone through, and hearing that very personal story and then reacting in the moment to it. So,
yeah, I've been amazed at just because I like a longer form, not the 4-hour marathons that Joe Rogan or Dan Carlin do, but I like the long form, and I think you're right. I think the less prescriptive I am in the questions that I ask, the more I learn about somebody. And I think it's frustrating after I get probably 80% of my information from podcasts at this point or other long form content. And it's always frustrating now when I turn on CNN or Fox or MSNBC and to see the way that they're trying to communicate things. I think it's just such a poor way of communicating. But it's great that we do have podcasts and YouTube channels and that sort of thing, because I do think that you learn way more through a conversation that's an hour or 2 hours long than you can in a 30-second soundbite.
Yeah, for sure. I enjoy the longer format, although I think one of the things I'm going to do is have both a long and short form, but even short form here is probably 15 to 20 minutes is what I'm looking at. But yeah, I totally agree. I think I don't have much interest in sound bites, right? Yeah. I mean, I don't know if that's the average user, but it works for me.
What have you seen nice side effects from just putting the podcast together and interviewing? Has it improved your conversation or improved your perspective on things, or what sort of things have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly humbling to a lot of times with these guests, I'm just like, wow, you've had such an interesting and amazing life. That's really fun and cool to see. I think it opens doors.
You and I have talked before over beers about just opportunities in the podcasting space. And obviously we see continued investment and consolidation in this space. It's really amazing. Big companies coming in, and it seems like there's a lot of opportunities out there still in this world. What do you have any thoughts on where you see all of this going, or new opportunities?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think as an engineer, you can't help but feel like, wow, what anybody who looks at the podcast space, you can't help but see opportunity. I mean, what is there, something like 7 or 8 million podcasts out there? Most of them are hobbyists, but there's some real effort being put into this space, and the number of hours listened by this overall market is just continuing to grow. And especially as you see things like what you're doing now, which I haven't taken the leap yet, is doing video. And I think we're kind of in this renaissance of the creator, right? And so I think about, there's a lot of opportunities to help people create more efficiently. Let's be real, right? Like editing and all of that of a podcast, publishing a podcast, it's a lot of work, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think there's some really exciting opportunities in that space, right? To basically help people spend more time on the things they care about, which is the creation process, right? Or the actual creation event, right? And maybe not as much on the stuff that they don't want to do when it comes to it. As you've probably seen too, there's so many one-off tools for so many different things in this space, right? And they're all they do this one little thing. They probably do it pretty well, but boy, is it hard to bring them all together.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Todd and I have talked a lot about building a professional podcast studio and layering in all these different services that people need. You may not need all of the services. You may not need video, but if you do want to do video, it isn't easy to just go do it. Even in some of the studios that I've walked into, it's, oh, you can bring a camera if you want.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
And then the editing and everything else. And then in the software space, it just seems like there's so many improvements that can be made to make it easier. It's difficult though, because there is a hardware component to it as well.
Well, and then there's that, the editing out all of the ums and ahs and all that kind of stuff. That actually takes work, right? And so you can't, for instance, automate a lot of that, or at least not yet. I know there are some attempts to do that, but the crazy thing is if you edit out too much of it, it actually doesn't sound natural either, right? So.
Well, look, we've covered a lot of ground here. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll link to your podcast in the show notes, with the caveat that you're going to be starting a new season here shortly.
Yeah, John, it's been a real pleasure to be here in person. Even this is my first time, I think, doing the live in-person studio, but a fantastic experience, and really appreciate your time and having me on.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Grant. Take care.